In the village of Ajibade, hidden between imposing mountains and forests that seemed to whisper ancient stories in the wind, Olayateo lived a simple but honorable routine. He was a man known for his hard work and dedication to the land. From his hands, cassava roots and yams came out that fed not only his family, but also a large part of the community. Beside him was Ajinola, his wife, a woman of unshakable faith and a heart as generous as her prayers. They had 2 sons, Tay and Kahind, who filled the house with laughter and mischief. Even during the Harmattan season, when the dry wind brought dust and the promise of challenges for the farmers. It was Christmas time, and with it came the tradition of visiting the ancestral village, where relatives gathered to share stories, songs, and meals around large bonfires. Ajinola, true to his convictions, suggested that the family dedicate a moment to prayer before the long journey. Olayateo, we need to put this journey in God's hands. We don't know what awaits us on the road, she said, her eyes full of concern. But Olayateo, with a slightly ironic smile, replied, Ajinola, God has more important things to take care of. We won't bother you with our little trips. Everything will go well, as always. Despite the calm tone of his words, Olayateo's stubbornness hid something deeper. He did not believe that God interfered in everyday matters. For him, hard work and luck were enough to guarantee success. Ajinola sighed and chose not to insist, but restlessness remained in his heart. Meanwhile, the village market was buzzing with the sound of voices negotiating prices and the rich smells of local spices. Olayateo, as always, was there, selling good quality cassava and exchanging laughs with acquaintances. Suddenly, a wrinkled hand grabbed his. He turned and met the penetrating gaze of Olayateo, an elderly woman respected for her wisdom and mysterious words. My son, she began in a low voice, almost a whisper, God sent me to you with a warning. There is something dangerous in your way. Before traveling, you must pray and seek the protection of the Almighty. Her tone was serious, almost solemn, and the weight of her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Olayateo looked at the elderly woman, feeling torn between respect and disbelief. He smiled, tried to ease the tension, and replied politely, Thank you, Olayateo. But don't worry, we'll be fine. Despite his courteous words, in his mind, he had already dismissed the warning as a figment of the old woman's superstitious imagination. After all, he was a practical man and preferred to rely on his preparation and knowledge of the roads rather than spiritual premonitions. But something in Olayatamedeo's gaze stayed with him. There was a weight to those words that he couldn't completely ignore, even as he walked home carrying the day's profits. He noticed that the wind seemed stronger, and the leaves on the trees swayed as if they wanted to tell secrets. Ajinola's silence when he arrived was also unusual, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. Ajinola, is everything okay? He asked, trying to break the silence as he sat down at the table to eat dinner. She hesitated before answering, her eyes fixed on the lamp that softly illuminated the room. Olayateo, I feel like something is not right. We have to trust God to guide and protect us. We cannot ignore the signs. But he shook his head and laughed, trying to hide the slight discomfort that was beginning to creep into his thoughts. You're worried for nothing. Let's prepare everything and leave early. The road is long, and we have a lot to do when we get there. He got up and began checking the items they would take, convinced that everything was under control. Ajinola watched in silence, but in his heart he began to cry out to God. She knew her husband was stubborn, but she also believed that the power of prayer could overcome even the most rigid barriers. As the night progressed and the Harmattan winds blew more intensely, Olayateo's house seemed enveloped in a subtle tension, almost imperceptible but undeniable. His stubbornness and Ajinola's silent faith were in a duel that would define much more than just a trip to the ancestral village. Olayatamedeo's warning was not forgotten, but lay buried beneath Olayateo's unyielding confidence in himself. However, fate was about to prove that some warnings should not be ignored. In the ancestral village of Agbajimo, surrounded by ancient stories and unshakable traditions. Fadik lived consumed by a feeling that was slowly eating away at her: envy. For years, she had watched Ollantayto prosper. He, the half-brother who, in her eyes, had received everything that should have been hers. The fertile land that produced abundance, the respect of the community, and a loving family that seemed a reflection of everything Fadik wanted but never had. The past hovered over her mind like a shadowy bird, constantly reminding her of the decision of the elders, who divided the inheritance in a way that she considered unfair. Ollantayto had taken most of the land, while Fadik was left with a dilapidated house and few resources. This decision, for her, was a clear symbol that fate had betrayed her. One afternoon, while walking along the dusty village paths, she heard the muffled sound of drums coming from the forest. It was the call of the feared sorcerer Babalawo Kazim, known for granting wishes in exchange for high prices. Fadik hesitated. I knew that entering that territory meant breaking a spiritual limit that many feared crossing. But his heart, filled with resentment, spoke louder. If justice doesn't come on its own, I'll make it happen, she muttered to herself, as if she needed to convince herself. Upon arriving at the sorcerer's sanctuary, she was greeted by a dense fog of incense that mixed herbal smells and something stronger, almost metallic. Kazim, a man with piercing eyes and a deep voice, observed her in silence before asking, "Why have you come to me, daughter of Agbajimo?" Fadik took a deep breath and, his voice filled with resentment, said, "I want Ollantayto to suffer like I suffered. He needs to feel the pain of loss, the pain of being ignored by the gods." She handed over a bag of coins, payment for the service she knew would be grim. Kazim accepted and promised that tragedy would come during Ollantayto's trip to the village, but warned her, "The spirits do not act without consequences. Make sure you are prepared for what may come back to you." Meanwhile, in Ajabade, Aginola felt an inexplicable weight in his chest. There was something she couldn't name, but that made her wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing. "Ollantayto, something is not right. I feel it. We need to pray before traveling," she said, for the third time that week. But Ollantayto, stubborn as ever, shook his head and replied, "Aginola, we have already talked about this. We have other things to worry about. The car needs maintenance. The bags are not packed yet. God has already blessed us enough. We don't need to bother him with small details." Aginola sighed and decided to pray alone. During the early hours of the morning, while everyone was sleeping, she knelt on the dirt floor of the small room and began to cry out, "Lord, I know that you see what I cannot see. Protect us from all evil. Divert any trap that is being prepared for us." His words were filled with faith, but also with anguish. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded for her family's safety. That same night, Fadik, restless, could not sleep. The sorcerer's words echoed in her mind, and a growing fear began to take over her. What if something goes wrong? What if the spirits come back to me? I thought, but she soon pushed the thoughts away, believing it was too late to turn back. He deserves this. I'm not wrong, she repeated to herself, like a mantra that tried to erase the emerging guilt. The next day, the sun rose brightly, and the village seemed enveloped in invisible tension. Ollantayto, busy with preparations, ignored the small signs around him. A crow perched on the fence, the absence of wind on a harmattan day, Aginola's silent glances as he folded his clothes for the journey. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how to convince him. Her faith was her only weapon, and she decided to use it until the last moment. Meanwhile, Fadik waited, sitting in front of the window of her house, watching the dry fields and the sky that seemed to carry something more than just clouds. She knew that the day of Ollantayto's journey was near, and with it would come what she believed to be her revenge. But deep down, a part of her heart began to question. Had she crossed a line that couldn't be undone? Ollantayto and Fadik's paths were now linked in ways neither of them could predict. While one trusted only in himself, The other bet everything on forces she barely understood. And through it all, Agenola stood as a pillar of faith, a flame of hope that continued to burn, even in the face of the shadows that began to form around her family. The tension was growing, like an approaching storm, invisible but inevitable. On the morning of the long-awaited trip, the sun rose shyly, filtered by the clouds of dust left by the Harmona. The children ran around the house with the excitement of those who couldn't wait to see their relatives in their ancestral village. Ollantayto, as always meticulous, checked the last details. He had inspected the car the night before, making sure everything was in perfect working order. However, when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine fell silent, as if asleep, ignoring Ollantayto's insistent attempts. He sighed deeply, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and tried again, but the car remained motionless, an unexpected obstacle on his journey. Agenola, upon hearing the repetitive and faulty sound of the ignition, approached with a sinking heart. Her foreboding intensified, as if something invisible warned her that the unexpected was not just a coincidence. Ollantayto, this is not normal. Maybe it's a sign. We must pray before moving forward. Her voice was calm, but it carried a seriousness that he chose to ignore. Agenola, it's just a mechanical failure. Nothing I can't solve. Don't worry about it, he replied, trying to hide the frustration that was beginning to bubble up inside him. After several failed attempts, he decided to call a mechanic friend from the village to help him. The man, known for his skill with engines, arrived quickly, but after inspecting the vehicle, shrugged his shoulders. I can't find any apparent problems, Ollantayto. The engine is in perfect condition, but for some reason it just doesn't work. This intriguing response caused Ollantayto, for the first time, to consider the possibility that something beyond his understanding might be at play. But he pushed that thought away, stubborn as ever. Maybe it's just one of those days, he said, forcing a smile to hide his uneasiness. Agenola, on the other hand, could not ignore the weight in his heart. Something told him that insisting on continuing his journey without seeking divine protection would be a mistake. Ollantayto, please let us take a moment to pray. It costs nothing. I feel like there is something wrong. But he shook his head, already irritated by the delay and the setback. Agenola, we don't have time for this now. We are already late. We need to find another way to get to the village. His tone, although firm, carried a hint of impatience, as if he was trying to drown out the voice of doubt that was beginning to whisper in his mind. Determined not to miss the celebration, they decided to use one of the community trucks that frequently transported residents between villages. The old truck, although full of signs of age, was known for its strength and reliability. Ollantayto quickly made arrangements, ensuring that he, Agenola, and their children had a place in the vehicle that would depart at noon. But even with the solution found, Agenola did not feel relieved. That weight was still there, like a shadow that she couldn't dispel. Before leaving, while Ollantayto loaded his bags into the truck, Agenola made a decision. She knew she needed to act, even if alone. He walked to the small local church, where the soft sunlight illuminated the altar. He knelt on the dirt floor, closed his eyes, and let his soul pour out every concern in sincere words. Almighty God, I know there is something I cannot see, but you know, protect my family from all evil, deflect any trap that has been placed in our path. Cover us with your mercy and lead us to safety. His words, although whispered, echoed in his heart with the strength of an unshakable conviction. As she prayed, she felt a momentary peace, as if she had placed an invisible shield around her family. But upon returning home, he found Ollantayto with the same confident expression, already loading the children into the truck. Agenola, let's go. The sooner we leave, the sooner we arrive, he said, trying to hurry her along. She nodded silently, but deep down, she knew this trip would be more than just a journey to the village. Something bigger was about to reveal itself. The engine stopped, the restlessness in his chest. Everything seemed to point to a truth that was still unclear. And as the truck drove off down the dusty road, Aginola continued to mutter his prayers, seeking strength and protection for what was to come. The road wound through dense forest, with ancient trees leaning as if silently watching what was about to happen. The truck continued at a steady pace, jolting slightly over the uneven ground. The air was dry, and the dust raised by the vehicle hovered like a blanket, mixing with the smell of the leaves burned by the Harmata. The children laughed and whispered in the back of the vehicle, while Aginola remained silent, her fingers tied around the rosary she carried in her lap. Her heart was restless, each bump of the truck amplifying her feeling that something was wrong. Ollantayto, however, seemed unconcerned, observing the surrounding scenery and exchanging casual words with the driver. Suddenly, the sound of birds chirping echoed through the forest. Before anyone could react, a tree trunk unexpectedly appeared in the middle of the road, as if it had been placed there on purpose. The driver tried to avoid it with a sudden movement, but the truck lost its balance, shaking violently before overturning. The sound of metal being dragged against the ground mixed with the screams of the passengers as the vehicle spun, each impact a wave of terror and chaos. When it finally stopped, everything was silent. Aginola opened her eyes, her heart racing, and realized she was alive. A cut on his forehead was bleeding, but the pain was overshadowed by the relief at seeing his children moving, scared but miraculously without serious injuries. She pulled them close to her, muttering a prayer of gratitude as tears streamed down her face. Ollantayto, however, was lying motionless with his eyes closed. A trickle of blood ran from his forehead, and the position of his body was worrying. Aginola screamed for help, her voice full of desperation, as she tried to reach her husband. Hours later, at the hospital in the nearest village, the diagnosis was given in a solemn tone by the doctor. Ollantayto had survived, but injuries to his spine had caused permanent paralysis from the waist down. He could never walk again. The news was a devastating blow, and the weight of his stubbornness finally began to fall on him. As he lay in the hospital bed, unable to move his legs, Ollantayto felt for the first time the impact of ignoring his wife's warnings and faith. In the ancestral village, news of the accident soon reached the ears of the elders. Between whispers and suspicious looks, rumors began to emerge about the possibility that this had not been a simple chance. Some residents recalled seeing Fadik, Ollantayto's half-sister, going to the house of witch doctor Babalawo Kazim days before the trip. Her words, full of resentment, had not gone unnoticed either. When questioned by the elders, Fadik tried to deny it, but her nervous expression and looks gave her away. Under pressure, she finally confessed, "I went to the wizard, but it was because I thought the inheritance should have been mine. He didn't deserve everything he got," she said, her voice shaking, the words coming out as a desperate attempt to justify her actions. The elders watched her with a mixture of disappointment and indignation. "Not only have you harmed your brother, but you have brought shame to your lineage. No matter what you believe to be unfair, turning to dark forces to seek revenge is a stain that will take time to erase," one of them said, with a firm tone. Fadik fell to his knees, tears flowing as he begged for forgiveness. However, the elders decided that she must face the consequences of her actions. She would be exiled from the community, a fate that, for many, was worse than death itself. As she was led away, Fadik realized that the envy that had consumed her had now turned into a burden that she would carry for the rest of her days. Back at the hospital, Aginola remained by Ollantayto's side, holding his hand as he processed the new reality. His eyes, once full of pride and confidence, were now filled with a mixture of regret and acceptance. He finally understood that he had ignored something much greater than his own strength and ability. As Aginola prayed in silence, he felt an unusual calm come over his heart. "I knew that in some way, this was an opportunity to start over, even if in a completely different way than I had imagined." Fate seemed, once again, to take an unexpected turn. In the silence of the hospital room, The monotonous sound of the heart monitor seemed to echo like a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Ollantayto lay motionless, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if trying to decipher the shadows that danced on the walls. His mind was in chaos. Memories of the accident still haunted him. The deafening sound of twisting metal, the screams of Aginola and the children, and the searing pain that shot through his body when everything stopped. Now, cruel reality stared him in the face. He would never walk again. This conscience was a crushing weight, but what hurt most was the guilt. He knew deep down that his stubbornness had set them on that path. Aginola entered the room with light steps, carrying a bowl of hot broth that he had carefully prepared. She placed the bowl on the table next to her and sat down next to her husband, holding his hand tenderly. God spared us, Ollantayto. He heard my prayers and protected us from the worst. But you need to open your heart to him. We can't continue like this, ignoring the signs. Ollantayto, still dejected, did not respond immediately. His throat felt tight, as if the words he was trying to say were stuck. He knew Aginola was right, but admitting it out loud felt like a mountain he still couldn't climb. Hours later, as the afternoon fell, a figure entered the room. It was Ollantayto, with her presence always striking, her deep eyes seeming to see far beyond the surface. She approached Ollantayto's bed and was silent for a moment, as if gathering the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but full of compassion. Ollantayto, you were saved by your wife's prayers. God heard her cry and reached out his hand to protect her family. But their stubbornness almost cost them all their lives. Now it's time for you to stop resisting. Open your heart to him before it's too late. Ollantayto's words hit Ollantayto like a wave. He felt a mixture of shame, regret, and something he couldn't immediately identify. His voice came out in a hoarse whisper. I ignored everything. The signs, the warnings. I thought I could solve everything myself. Ollantayto nodded slightly, as if she already knew what he would say. You still have a chance to change, Ollantayto. God does not turn his back on those who seek him, but it takes humility to recognize that we cannot do everything on our own. Meanwhile, back in his ancestral village, Fadik was facing the consequences of his actions. The elders, gathered in a circle, watched her with stern looks as she trembled under the weight of judgment. Fadik, you have brought disgrace to your family and this community. Your resentment and your envy have gone too far. What you did cannot be ignored. Consulting a sorcerer to harm your own brother. That is something our village will never tolerate. The words of one of the elders cut through the air like a sharp blade. Fadik, on his knees, cried uncontrollably. I made a mistake. I know I made a mistake, but the pain of the injustice I felt consumed me. Please have mercy. The elders, however, were unanimous in their decision. She would be exiled from the village, a severe punishment, but necessary to preserve the community's harmony. Fadik, now alone, carried the weight of her choice, knowing she could never return to the place she once called home. Her tears were of regret, but also of an emptiness that might never be filled. Back at the hospital, Ollantayto felt a light breeze enter through the window, as if the air itself carried a message of renewal. He shook hands with Aginola, who remained at his side, and spoke in a voice that seemed to have regained some strength. I need to change, Aginola. I can't go on like this. I see now that God never stopped being with us, even when I refused to believe. Aginola smiled, a look of relief and hope lighting up his face. It's never too late to start, Ollantayto. He has always been waiting for you. Ollantayto watched in silence, but with a look that said more than 1,000 words. She knew that this journey of faith and redemption was just beginning, but the first step had been taken. Ollantayto's hardened heart began to open, and with that, a new story began to be written. The weight of the past was still there, but now there was the promise that, with faith and humility, it could be left behind. The months that followed the accident brought profound and unexpected changes to Ollantayto. The life he knew built around his physical strength and hard work, had been turned upside down. Now, confined to a wheelchair, he faced a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, and above all, regret. The nights were long, and the silence in the hospital room was filled with memories of the accident and the faces of his family. He couldn't forget the look in Aginola's eyes that fateful day, filled with worry but also unwavering love. It was a constant reminder that their stubbornness had almost led them to tragedy. Aginola, ever steadfast in his faith, stood by his side, a pillar of strength amid the storm. Patiently, she cared for him and encouraged him to find a new purpose. Every night, she read the scriptures aloud, sharing stories of redemption and overcoming that brought a little comfort to Oluteo's heart. At first, he just listened silently, but something inside him began to change. The words that once seemed distant began to resonate differently, as if they were meant for him. One day, as Aginola was reading Psalm 23, he finally broke the silence. "Aginola, do you believe that God can use me like this, in this condition?" he asked, his voice breaking. She held his hand and replied with a hopeful smile, "God never wastes a life. He has bigger plans than we can imagine." These words lit a fire in Oluteo. He began studying the scriptures on his own, spending hours immersed in passages that spoke of faith, repentance, and purpose. It was a slow but transformative process. The man who once relied solely on his physical strength now found comfort and direction in something much greater. He began writing reflections on the lessons he was learning, filling pages with thoughts he would never have considered at another time. As his understanding grew, he felt a deep desire to share his journey with others. At first, Oluteo hesitated. The idea of speaking in public intimidated him, especially in his new condition. But Aginola, as always, was there to encourage him. "Your story can change lives, Oluteo. It's not about how you walk, it's about how you touch people's hearts." Inspired by her words, he decided to take the first step. He gathered some friends and neighbors at his house and began to share his reflections. His sincerity and humility touched everyone, and the small group grew quickly. Soon, he was leading Bible studies in the village, attracting people of all ages who came to hear his words. As Oluteo was building a new purpose for his life, news of Fadik reached him. After her exile, she had wandered through distant villages, struggling with loneliness and regret. A traveler brought news of her death, saying she had died alone, consumed by her choices and the guilt she could never overcome. Upon hearing this, Oluteo felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He knew that the grudge he carried towards her needed to be left behind. Forgiveness was the only way to find peace, both for himself and for Fadik's memory. Determined to close this chapter of his life, Oluteo traveled to his ancestral village. The road was familiar, but it carried new meaning. Upon arrival, he visited the place where Fadik had lived and prayed for her. His words were not of condemnation, but of liberation. "May God have mercy on your soul and welcome you into his grace," he said, with a light heart. For the first time in years, he felt free from the weight of the past. The act of forgiving was not just for Fadik, it was for himself, so that he could move forward with a renewed soul. Back in the village, Oluteo's story became an example for everyone. He was no longer remembered just as the strong and dedicated farmer, but as a man whose life was transformed by the power of faith and forgiveness. He continued to lead studies, sharing his experiences and teaching about the dangers of envy and the power of love and compassion. His words echoed across generations, inspiring young and old to seek peace, even in the face of adversity. Years later, Oluteo reflected on his journey with gratitude. He had lost the ability to walk, but gained something much greater: a deep connection with God, a renewed purpose, and the ability to touch lives. His story became a living testimony that, even in the darkest moments, there is always the chance to start over, as long as you are willing to open your heart to what really matters. Faith didn't just transform him. She lifted him up, making him a beacon of hope amidst life's difficulties. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.